Welcome back. This is Gary Miranda once again, and today I'm going to focus on some poems that have to do with poetry and poets. The first three of these poems all relate to the art and craft of writing poetry. I've never found the distinction between art and craft to be particularly useful, since all art includes craft, but not all craft includes art. A distinction I find more to the point is that between the given and the earned, the given being what the muse provides, and the earned being what the poet adds in the form of editing and revising. Most poems, at least most of mine, involve both, though occasionally a poem will come full-blown and require almost no revision. That wonderfully marred human being, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, claimed that the poem Kubla Khan was dictated to him in a dream, and that he simply wrote it down on waking. You can't always trust old Sam, but even if I'm inclined to give him this one, Kubla Khan is not a poem that you or I or anyone who hasn't spent a lifetime honing their craft would come up with in a dream. More often than not, the editing and revising process amounts to simply trying to find out what the poem wants to be. If the muse drops something in your lap that wants to be a sonnet and you don't have the experience or skill to handle a sonnet, your poem is going to arrive stillborn. Sometimes, of course, the muse is stubbornly reticent, or perhaps just out of town attending a muses conference. During such times, I've perversely attempted to write a poem out of sheer craft. The first of the three poems here is such a poem, and is, in fact, about the process of trying to write such a poem, even though it purports to be about the making of an arrowhead. Arrowhead. First, you must find a rock that has always wanted to be a bird, to sing, fly. It is hard. Next, you must chip away its minor desires, respecters of ground, moss, the irrelevant sparks. You must shape it into the unromanticized heart, tongue for the deep kiss, shoulders for holding. Finally, you must teach it to cover its tracks. Windbreaker, it must learn to mend the shards of air as it goes, swift, tender, to the bone. It is hard. It took me about a month to write the poem Arrowhead. This in contrast to some of the other poems I've been reading that might have taken as little as 20 minutes. I'm not sure how other poets rank their poems, but I tend to value the given over the earned. Perhaps this is inherent in the nature of a gift, or perhaps it's just that I'd rather be grateful than proud. This next poem is called Ars Poetica, and, well, the title speaks for itself if you know a little Latin. It describes the two processes I've been talking about, but unlike Arrowhead, spotlights the given rather than the earned. I sometimes think of the joint processes as a river, with the given being the water and the earned being the banks. I'm especially aware of this distinction when I'm working with students. The banks can be taught, the water not so much. Ars Poetica. Ambiance, feckless, ineluctable. Sometimes you think it would all be clear if you merely increased your vocabulary, learning words that line up possibilities like birds on a wire or clothespins. The real trick is to let the whole menagerie of undone acts leap toward you, so that your surprise is not an act, or if an act of recognition you've been saving expressly for strangers. Commas, quarter moons, kindnesses. those metal humps on bridges that the car goes over, and you know there is no cause for alarm. You gather them in with almost love. They take you home. The third and final poem about the art of poetry, or rather about art of any kind, is the title poem of the book, Listeners at the Breathing Place. It is, in my opinion, the best of the three poems in that it not only describes the process, but illustrates it, capturing some of the mystery and awe. The poet and essayist Randall Jarrell once described a poet as a person who manages, in a lifetime of standing out in thunderstorms, to be struck by lightning 5 or 6 times. The point here is not how many times you get struck by lightning, but that you spend your life standing out in thunderstorms in the first place. Listeners at the Breathing Place. There's an epigraph here which reads, "The seal hunters sometimes call themselves listeners at the breathing places." From Eskimo Prince by James Houston. The air says what it means, regardless of what we want it to say. It holds our breath. Conundrums tumble like seals. We listen. We catch one, if we are lucky, the way a camera catches the gallop of horses, their legs in positions we would never imagine. Van Gogh knew. There is something to be said for the word's inadequacies, the swirls of light and movement which will always escape, astound us. Rain on water, a lover's turning to go. Those places breathe too, saying, "Be brave, believe in us." In the end, we will lay down our words and embrace the air that shapes them here, just as at the peak of loving, a cry shakes the candles aureola in a room too small for all this, and the body for now needs to be held back from that blinding other. The final 3 poems I'm going to read today reference certain poets, one of whom I admired from a distance, one whom I knew personally, and one whom I didn't know at all. The Greek poet George Safaris died in 1971, and I happened to be living in Athens, Greece on a Fulbright grant when his funeral was held there. Many of Safaris's poems had been set to music by Mikis Theodorakis, who is best known for composing the scores for the movies Zorba the Greek and Z. Consequently, even Greeks who might not have read Safaris's poetry were familiar with it by way of Theodorakis, even though the latter's music was banned in Greece by the junta that was in power in 1971. Yorgos Papadopoulos, who was prime minister at the time, had allowed Safaris's funeral to take place in Athens on the explicit condition that none of his various poems that had been set to music by Theodorakis were to be sung on the occasion, an order that was backed up by the presence of tanks in the streets of Athens during the funeral procession. Predictably, Greeks being Greeks, a few scattered voices, then thousands of voices, began singing Safaris's poem, Denial, as the mourners followed the car carrying the poet's body to the cemetery, so that the funeral turned into the first openly defiant public demonstration against the junta. Unpredictably, Papadopoulos had the good sense not to attempt stopping it and ordered the soldiers in the tanks to stand down. I've always been of a mind that the most important thing a poet can learn from other poets is not style, but courage. And Seferis's influence bears this out. This poem of mine is merely a modest tribute to a poet I admire. Going, to George Seferis. Dying is not the worst you could do, old man. There are places in the world where rockers sit for decades on a porch and fade and dry to a chalky semblance of themselves. You go like a heron down some swamp, its long wings taking the air in gulps, so that the trees seem to lean in against their wills and listen. Listen. The sound of your going has a length of its own. Years fall from your death like rain. The second of these poems is more personal and is dedicated to a late friend of mine named Dwayne Rail. I first met Dwayne when I was a graduate student at the University of California, Irvine. Unlike Dwayne, who was in the creative writing program, I was going for a PhD in literary criticism. But I'd chosen Irvine because its creative writing program was headed by a well-known poet from the Iowa School, which was very much in vogue at the time. Dwayne hailed from Gertie, Oklahoma, a town originally called Buzzard's Flop, whose population was well under 200. As might be expected, Dwayne's poems had a distinctively rural, even bucolic tone. I still recall a line from a poem of his called Shooting Squirrels that went, "Squirrels could never resist one look at me." Wonderful. Unfortunately, under the influence of the Iowa School, by the time Dwayne left Irvine, his poems were starting to sound much like those of all the other poets in the creative writing program, namely imagistic with little direct statement and even less overt emotion. Dwayne eventually became aware of the influence and reverted to his former, more natural style. But the experience made me very aware of the pitfalls of poetry workshops, an awareness that put me in good stead when I later came to conduct workshops of my own. Again, this is more than you need to know, but here is my poem for Dwayne. The Fox, for Dwayne Rail. I always wanted to be a fox, you said. Singularly unequipped for foxhood, you scribbled poems about some scavenger lad who'd scurry down sewers the cops could never find him in, living on pilfered apple rinds, grapes in season, and the gleanings of his mind. I mention it merely as one who knows hawks from handsaws, hide from seek, and who likes in you what never would have made it as a fox. As a follow-up to that last poem, I might mention that I never got my PhD at Irvine. I completed my coursework and even passed the oral exam, but left before I finished my thesis. I was on track to get the first ever PhD in literary criticism from the school, and my advisor told me that if I left, I would always be a second-class citizen. But my poems, which were always a step or two ahead of me, knew better. Every poem that I wrote during that period had the same theme: escape. The very first poem I read in this series of podcasts, The One That Got Away, is an example, as is this next poem, The Exam Committee. I can be pretty dense, but I finally got the message. I didn't want a PhD. I wanted to be a poet. The poet referred to in this poem is John Clare, a 19th century British poet who was known for his pastoral poems about the English countryside, but who became delusional and spent a good deal of his later life in insane asylums. He was a docile soul, but managed to escape from an asylum in Essex and walk 90 miles back to his home. Yet another example of poetic courage. I'm rather proud of the fact that the wonderful British town names referenced in the poem are the actual names of the towns that John Clare passed on his way home, in the order that he would have passed them. This is one of those gratuitous achievements that no one other than the achiever would appreciate. But now that I've shared it with you, feel free to be impressed. The Exam Committee. Reread Shelley. It can't kill you, they tell me, as I decompose unnoticed before their eyes. They talk of integrity, the departments, the exams, everyone's but mine. They begin to debate among themselves what Prometheus Unbound is all about. And while they are thus preoccupied, I slip out and down the hall, convinced there's a better way to die. And I see myself as sly John Clare, loose from the loon house, hoofing it north on the great York Road, past Jack's Hill, Baldock, Biggleswade, and Bugden, out of Essex. Once again, thanks for listening. This is Gary Miranda saying with Theodore Roethke, wake the happy words.